So without further ado, I suppose I will introduce them. So first up, we have Erica Smith-Fitchman. Erica has spent her career connecting people with plants. She is the community forestry manager at Philadelphia Parks and Recreation, and she's the project lead for the Tree Philly plan, or for the Philly Tree Plan, excuse me. Erica also supervises the amazing Tree Philly team who provide Philadelphia residents with the resources they need to plant and care for trees in their own backyard. She is a certified ISA arborist and a recipient of the Arbor Day Foundation's 2018 Trailblazer Award. Erica received a Bachelor in Science and Biology from Haverford College and an MS in Environmental Horticulture from the University of California, Davis. And presenting along with Erica is Marissa Wilson. Marissa is dedicated to promoting equity, climate resiliency, and community connection to nature and neighbors. As Philadelphia Parks and Rec's urban forestry community organizer, she leads community engagement efforts for the Philly Tree Plan and collaborates with communities to help achieve their vision for their local environment. She holds a BS in biology and a BA in environmental social science from Davidson College. And today they will be talking about community outreach for Philadelphia's Urban Forest Strategic Master Plan. So take it away, Erica and Marissa.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. I am getting a lot of ding-dongs when people join, so I hope that that doesn't interrupt too much, but I'm really excited to be here. I have been participating in the UEC for 10 years now, and it has been a really huge source of information, generous people giving that information, a lot of the way that we shaped our tree giveaway program was based on collaboration and like asking questions of this group. So I'm really excited to be back presenting, and I see a lot of familiar faces. So I'm excited to be talking to everyone. And one of the things I love the most about UEC is that it is a really nice, safe space to share successes and challenges. So we're really excited to talk to you about what we've been doing and to answer all of your questions, as many as possible. And we actually have a couple of folks here that have also been participating in the Philly Tree Plan work. So we've got Max Blaustein, who's on our project team, and Marcus Ferreira is here too on our Community Voices steering committee. So we have a couple of folks who can actually help answer questions. So I'm going to go over kind of what is the plan and what the context is for why we're doing it and how we're talking about it a little bit. And then I'm going to hand it over to Marissa to talk in depth about the community outreach efforts that we did and some of the preliminary things we've learned from that. Just to kind of set the stage, we are about 2/3 of the way through our planning process right now. So we have not completed the plan yet, but we have just completed the community outreach aspects, and we are drafting the recommendations now to be shared with our project team in August. So we're kind of like in the middle of it all, but this is a great time for us to talk to you about kind of what we've just completed and what we learned from it. So the Philly Tree Plan is a 10-year strategic plan for Philly's trees for the planting and care of our urban forest. And the main values that we are guided by in this process are environmental justice, community engagement, and sustainability. So this means that a huge part of our process is listening to the community and trying to create a plan that that addresses their concerns and supports them in the ways that they need it the most. The scope that we're working with is the entirety of the community of the urban forest here in Philly. So we are tackling trees on residential area, public parks, industrial areas, commercial areas, riparian, institutional campuses, a lot, pretty much any tree issue we're trying to address and really, look at the urban forest as the system that it truly is. We have a lot of people who have been involved in this process. As I mentioned, we have a project team of city agencies, nonprofit staff, state and federal agencies who have been advising on the plan and doing the on-the-ground work through subcommittees throughout the process. We also have an amazing community voices steering committee of about 30 residents who represent communities across the city who are doing urban greening work and who have been advising at various points throughout the plan process. And Marissa is going to talk in depth about that. We have a steering committee of, again, other city agencies, nonprofits, state and federal agency representatives who are advising at kind of a more zoomed out level, but we are folks who are not doing the on the ground work, but are very involved and engaged. And then we have a team of consultants, one prime consultant, and I think 7 sub-consultants. So the scope of work that we're doing is quite large, and we have quite a varied team that is tackling it. The main things that we are trying to accomplish in terms of buckets of recommendations are setting new canopy goals and metrics that are more nuanced than what we've been working with before, both in terms of the types of metrics we're working with, and also the geographic area for each of the goals. We've never been working with a citywide goal. It's always been based on neighborhoods, but we're taking that to even more nuance and talking about different land use and management units, canopy goals for different regions, and different metrics other than canopy as well that we can be using to talk about our canopy. We're also doing a lot of recommendations to changing city policy and legislation, not only for protecting existing trees, but also planting new trees and funding mechanisms as well. We're working to recommend ways to promote better communication between residents and the city, and amongst all the different stakeholders. We will have recommendations for management of trees within those different management units and regions, and of course, identifying funding needs and goals for all of this work. So a little bit about how we are framing this when we talk about it to not only the public, but also decision makers and legislators. We are approaching it as, making the case that trees are public health infrastructure and a basic component of healthy neighborhoods. And they're more than just a nice thing to have. They're critical tools to help us address the city's priorities and improving quality of life for residents. So, this group, I don't really need to go into the details, but the things that we have been emphasizing in our messaging are the effect of trees in battling the heat island effect, cleaning the air, resilience to climate change, and reducing crime and violence in our communities. And then the major message that basically spans the entirety of the plan and the planning process is equity. I know that everyone has been seeing a lot of these articles, and we're all really excited to be seeing this highlighted in major news outlets about tree equity and the op-eds that have been coming out. We were really especially excited at the timing of this one, and they used Philly as the backdrop for the main story map here. So tree equity is really what it all comes down to. And I think the next slide shows a bit more about how the trees in Philly are actually distributed. So in 2019, we did a tree canopy assessment with the University of Vermont, which was the second one we've done. The last one was in 2011. And we found out that we do have about 20% canopy on average, but as you can see, it is not equitably distributed. This is not a huge surprise to this group. But in addition, on the next slide, you can see how we've actually lost tree canopy over the last 10 years. Again, not in an equitable way. It has been focused a lot in residential areas. In the northeast of the city that you can see up here, there are a lot of yards and a lot of residential space. So that kind of shows the trend there pretty well. And this map actually shows a much finer scale of what the urban forest looks like in Philly, and it is also overlaid with the redlining map. You know, redlining is a huge source of historic injustice and shows, you can very easily see how current trends in public health indicators, including tree canopy, line up with areas that were historically redlined. You can see the orangish reddish areas are the lowest grade in the redlining here in Philadelphia. And a little bit more about kind of why we see the distribution that we do here in Philadelphia. We have a history of development patterns and barriers for renters, again, redlining, and then budget cuts that play into the way that our canopy is distributed. Philadelphia, you know, is a huge industrial city, and we have a lot of neighborhoods that the housing was built around the factories, and housing built for industry workers were, you know, not designed with trees in mind. And so that has a huge part to play in where the tree canopy is today. We also have a lot of renters in the city, and this is a historic and current barrier because only a property owner can request or approve the planting of a street tree in the city, and the maintenance and care of trees along the street and in yards, of course, falls to the homeowners, and the homeowners who can afford to hire private contractors and have the most time and resources to have robust volunteer-run organizations locally are the ones that have the best canopy. So renters are disproportionately people of color here in the city. So this is a huge part of the trend as well. Redlining, as we talked about, it was a program, just in case anyone needs a refresher. So the Homeowners Loan Corporation was a government-sponsored company established in 1933 as part of the New Deal, and they gave letter grades to neighborhoods based on whether they were good places to invest government money. And the lowest areas, and the areas that were given the lowest grades were areas where it was really difficult to get a home loan. And they were often areas, and they were documented as areas that had a lot of people of color in there. So there's a lot of racism involved in that. And that has a huge impact on where our trees are today, because trees follow investment. We also have, similar to many large cities in the country, a history of white flight in the city. In the 1950s, a lot of those factories closed and jobs moved out of the city. And many of the white middle class residents who could afford to leave also left. So the folks who were left, Black, brown, and low income white residents, could not afford to leave, and they had decaying infrastructure and reduced city budgets for services. And so again, this is all part of the history of why trees are where they are in the city. So, you know, there are a lot of public health factors that are related to trees, and the heat island effect is one of those. We have a wonderful Office of Sustainability and Public Health Department that have created these maps of the heat index in the city. And heat is a huge public health crisis here and in many US cities. So you can see how some of these current public health problems like high heat are related to the redlining, historic redlining. You can see the overlap here, the correlation between high heat and historic injustice is not a surprise to any of us. And trees are correlated with high heat as well. And so heat is one of the factors that we're using in prioritizing where to focus investment in the recommendations for the Philly Tree Plan. This is a map of the prioritization that we did. So one of the very first things we did with the Philly Tree Plan is talk about this history and how we can prioritize areas for greater investment into the future. So we used heat exposure, we used density of industrial activity, and all of the things that you see on this list here to identify where we should be prioritizing investment, but also where we need to be hearing from people during creation of the plan. We used it both during plan creation, and we will be using it in the results and recommendations. So some of the public health factors that we've used include asthma rates, mental health, and cancer rates. And here in Philadelphia, the reasons we chose some of those factors are that Philadelphia is named an asthma capital, the top of the major US cities for ER visits, deaths, and asthma prevalence, and poverty is a top risk factor for asthma. We have over 25% poverty rate here in the city of Philadelphia. We also have reports that show that 16% of Philadelphians report frequent mental stress, and this is worse amongst low-income individuals, and 1 in 4 Philadelphia adults are diagnosed with depression. Finally, cancer is one of 6 leading causes of death in Philadelphia that can be prevented or improved through lifestyle and environment. So that's kind of some of the reasons why we chose those public health indicators in our prioritization. And we also had a lot of conversations with our Community Voices Steering Committee to talk about what other factors we should be considering when we do this prioritization, which I think Marissa will touch on. But again, this prioritization map we used not only we will be using it in the final recommendations for the plan, but we also used it throughout our community outreach efforts to make sure that we were hearing from people in these highest priority areas. There are many other things that correlate with tree canopy across the city, and gun violence is one of them, and has obviously been a huge topic of concern, especially for our legislators. They bring it up over and over again. And, you know, people, those of us who are in this field, we know a lot of the correlations, and there are a lot of studies that show the effect of healthy, well-maintained green space on crime and violence. But this image has been really effective in talking to our legislators specifically, because you can so easily see the correlation between shootings, neighborhoods of high priority that came through our environmental justice prioritization. Those are the orange ones. And then the tree canopy, which is in other areas. So again, we are still in the middle of our actual planning process. We've done two of the phases. We've just completed all of our community engagement, which Marissa is going to go into in a lot more detail. And then in the next quarter of the year, we will be developing our recommendations, vetting them through all of our steering committees and project teams, and then having a public comment period before we finalize the plan at the end of the year. And I see a couple of questions that have come in through the chat, and I just want to see if I can answer any of them. Is the landowner approval of a tree to be planted part of the city code? So in terms of a property owner in Philadelphia, a property owner needs to sign off on approval of a street tree. It is street trees in Philadelphia are the legal ownership of the property owner, but the city has jurisdiction over their care. So it's pretty complicated. I'm not sure if it's in the city code proper, but it is the legal ownership relationship here in the city. Describing the specific channels and modes of outreach is what Marissa is going to do right now. Thanks for that question, Beth.
Thank you, Erica, for setting the stage on all of that. I'll go ahead, Beth, and get in with all of how we got input. So it was a really robust engagement process for this plan. We really wanted it to be collaborative. driven by environmental justice, and really seeking out the voices of folks who have not been included in these processes in the past. And we've seen through some of these mechanisms for why there aren't trees in certain areas of Philadelphia, how the lack of engagement of communities in decision-making processes leads to greater inequity, loss of trees in those neighborhoods, or a lack of trees in the first place. And so we really wanted to focus our work on bringing that empowerment, really asking people, digging in and figuring out what people wanted for their neighborhoods, and determining how we could, through this work, affect how people live their lives every single day, and how their relationships to trees can be improved in our city. So we did this through a number of ways. And in addition to thinking about where we were doing our outreach, and thinking and having everything be chosen through that map of where investment needed to happen, that drove a lot of our engagement practices. But there were also these additional oh, excuse me, my slides are a little bit messed up. But we had some other additional things that we were also driving this work. And a lot of that was determined in coordination with our Community Voices Steering Committee. So this was an amazing group of 30 leaders from neighborhoods across Philadelphia, active residents who were doing work in greening their community and doing tree work, who helped guide our process of how we were engaging people, what that engagement looked like, where we were doing engagement, all of this. And these folks have been critical to making our plan and our engagement efforts a success. And they're going to continue to be a part of this work as they evaluate the plan that our consultant team comes up with. So in addition to geographic focus, we also had some other engagement priorities, really focusing in on truth telling, making sure that we are bringing to the forefront the experiences that people have had, being honest about what the city has done in the past, and what has led to things being the way they are. Emphasizing plain language, that we wanted everybody to feel like they could, we knew that everybody had a story to tell about trees. And we didn't want the way that we brought the information to people to keep people from being able to talk with us about their experiences. So making sure that when we were talking about some like seemingly complex policy programs or recommendations, that we were writing it in language that people could engage with, that we weren't using terms or acronyms or anything like that that was going to keep people from feeling like they could engage with our work. Also, a huge aspect of this is honoring the expertise of every individual, knowing that every person is an expert in their own experience, and an expert in the experience in their neighborhood, and placing that same level of honor as you would on a practitioner. So making sure that when we were listening with the ears that you would give to anybody else working in this field as well. Also listening without ego. A lot of this work was coming to people and asking, tell us everything that's not working. And if you have a lot of ego in this space, you're not going to be able to take that. It'll be really difficult to actually learn from those experiences. So placing whatever ego you had in this work to the side so that you could listen more deeply and really address the base problems. And then also engage non-traditional partners, look beyond, engage all of the folks who have been doing this environmental work all along, but also think about how trees are impacting asthma rates, and how are we going to engage the parents who are dealing with asthma in their children, or cancer rates, and how are we going to engage folks around the public health issues, around the spiritual health issues, all of these kinds of things. So a big piece of this was this virtual open house that is still open, and I encourage you all to check it out. A lot of what Erica presented before fell into this unfair forest presentation in the center, where we collected for I'm I'm not sure if it's the first time, but it was certainly a big effort to bring together a lot of this knowledge about the history of why trees are where they are in Philadelphia, and then write it in a way that is accessible to everyone, translating it out of like academic articles, out of public histories, out of all of these spaces, and writing that up to share with people, to say, this is why things are the way they are. And please, we created a space below each of these presentations where you could engage and say, tell us the histories that we weren't able to include. You have something specific in your neighborhood that you want to add to this, knowing that no matter what, we could never capture the entire experience of the city and how people have related to trees. We also laid out in plain language what the tree plan is trying to do and how it was going to do that. Knowing that a planning process is not something that everybody has gone through, and that you need to share exactly what's going on, and that transparency is really important. We also attended community meetings across the city. We prioritized who we were going to spend our time talking with based on that prioritization map that you saw earlier that was created in collaboration with the Community Voices Steering Committee. We prioritized attending meetings that already existed, knowing that going to people as opposed to bringing people to us was going to be more effective. We also worked really hard to tailor presentations to based on what we knew of experiences in the neighborhoods, saying, when we are presenting about where the urban forest is, making sure that we're saying alleyways and neighborhoods that have alleyways, because that's often a space that's forgotten, because it is literally in the back of houses. But doing that acknowledgement really made an impact on the people who were at those meetings, and they were much more willing to share because of that. We also made sure to leave the majority of the time for input. Those presentations were about 6 minutes long, with 16 to 14 minutes for people to actually share their points of view. And in some cases, we took over the entire meeting and people just shared with us for the full hour what their experience with trees had been. We also created a city-wide survey that emphasized language, plain language questions to get impact, learn about people's interests in different policy options, what their value of trees was, creating opportunities for people to tell stories, which over 1,000 people engaged in the storytelling aspects in the survey. And we also translated this into 8 languages and got responses in 8 languages. And that was huge for accessibility. We also pushed this through distribution networks that might not be as traditional or what you first think of. We of course sent it out through every environmental organization, through our Community Voices Steering Committee that we are connected to, but we also pushed it through pedestrian advocacy networks, tenants' rights organizing groups, immigrant support organizations, and much more, trying to make that connection. And when we did that, we were making explicit asks saying, this is how we see this connecting to your work. We would love for the people that you serve to engage with this process, because we think that their information and their experience is really valuable in informing this work. We also hired 22 paid ambassadors from 5 neighborhoods. These ambassadors, their job was not to evangelize for trees or go out and tell people why this is a good thing. Their job was to be representatives of their neighborhoods in this work, to go out, do the peer-to-peer interviews, ask people what their experiences had been with trees, good and bad, and bring that back to us. So they engaged in peer-to-peer interviews, neighborhood walking workshops where we walked through their neighborhood with them, and looked at the experience that they have every single day, and they could share that with us. And then there's also skill building elements, like learning how to do better photography, learning how to interview your peers, how to engage with planning processes in the future. And lastly, we hosted 7 stakeholder workshops with these different kinds of buckets of organizations. These are more the practitioner focused although there was a lot of variety depending on which stakeholder workshop, but this allowed us to get some of those like fine-grained details of what it's like to be a practitioner in these different fields, and how that relates to urban forestry and the needs that people see from their experience in the fields. So all in all, we had a lot of engagement. The survey garnered nearly 7,000 responses. Philly is a city of 1.6 million, so clear, you know, there are a lot of people to engage, but 7,000 is pretty impressive. Our consultants early on had stated 3,000 as the goal, so we were pretty excited about that. And as I said, across 8 languages. Another element of this is that we figured out what percentage of those survey responses were coming from our highest priority zip codes, and 46% of them ultimately came from those zip codes. Our goal was 50%, so we didn't quite meet that goal, but we were pretty close. We also went to 32 community meetings where we talked to 847 residents directly about their experiences. And I do also want to highlight these two points, the flyering and the phone banking. Throughout the process, we were checking in with our numbers, seeing how we were doing in terms of our outreach, especially our geographic distribution. And as we were seeing the surveys come in and noticing that we weren't getting as many people in our priority areas as we had hoped, we implemented these additional ways of getting more input from those folks. So we put up yard signs in parks in priority areas where we had seen low amounts of engagement. We also put out 2,500 door hangers in those neighborhoods, translated into English and Spanish with a QR code for people to take the survey. And we saw in the survey responses that people were in fact engaging because of that. We also paid 10 community members to make phone calls and send text messages to ask people directly over the phone of all of the questions in the survey and take down those responses, as well as sending them text messages with links to the survey. And we targeted those in demographics and geographic locations that we were seeing low engagement. And that definitely got us closer to our 50% number. So what did we actually learn? There's a lot in here, and we are still processing so much of this information, but I'm just going to go over some of the top level like themes that emerged through this process. So one thing that we heard a lot is, and as Erica said, there's a real push to be naming trees as essential infrastructure and the essential infrastructure that they in fact are. But also when you talk to residents about a tree, it's not like talking to them about their electrical wires or the sewer lines that run under the street. Trees are essential to our public health, but they go so far beyond that in impacting our mental, our physical, our emotional, our spiritual health, connecting us to our neighbors and building community, connecting ourselves to ideas of things bigger than ourselves. This one quote is absolutely amazing. And I have so many others. It was so hard to choose which one to put in this place, but from our survey response, as a naturalized citizen in a foreign country, nature offers a comfort such as the familiarity of trees and other spiritual nature-inspired scenes that can instantly transport a person home that may be feeling homesick or overwhelmed by the many differences of culture. Something as simple as a lovely scene filled with trees elsewhere, far, far away, is capable of making that darkness disappear completely. So that's just like a beautiful little anecdote that someone took the time to share with us in the survey about how an experience with trees connects them back to their homeland and makes it easier to live in a foreign city. Another big thing that came out is that people generally like trees. Of course, there's always like a few exceptions. And the fact that there aren't trees in their neighborhood is not because they don't like trees or they don't value trees, but it's that the burden of having a tree is too high. So here is another quote. When I was born in Juniata, the street was tree lined. Now I'm 22 and I still live on the same block, but now there are only 2 trees on the street and one is diseased and the other is dying. Trees died and people won't replace them because of concerns of roots and sewers and the cost of and sidewalk damage. Neighbors didn't want to take on the liability and the cost of new trees. The air is worse now. The neighbors need support for people who plant trees so that they can not carry that burden alone. So once again, it's not that people don't want trees. It's that they are not capable of taking on the cost, and that trees are a huge community asset. But when one person has to carry that liability and that cost, it becomes too burdensome to bear. There is also this aspect of every tree someone experiences is an ambassador for trees. We recognize again and again that not all canopy is good canopy, and a bad experiences with a tree can cause residents to become distrustful of both the systems that put trees there and are there to care for trees, and also the trees themselves. This is from a woman in Point Breeze from an RCO meeting. Here are my notes. Her experiences with weed trees in the alley have made her not want to get a tree in the future, not even in the sidewalk. And this is despite in the meeting recognizing that the trees that are planted in the sidewalk are very different species and types of trees than the trees in alleyways. She needs proof of the city addressing alleyways before she can consider bringing in a new tree. So although we see trees as street trees or yard trees or alleyway trees or weed trees, for the actual resident, these all exist in the same system, and every tree is going to impact how people feel about the rest of the trees in their neighborhood. Trees also, as it's not just us in the research saying that trees are in areas where there is less poverty and more resources, but residents are feeling this as well. We heard from our ambassadors, we heard in community meetings, we heard in the survey that trees symbolize the difference between the haves and have-nots. You know if you're on a wealthy block or a poor block based on how many trees there are there. From one block captain and long-term resident in Hunting Park, a neighborhood that deals with many issues, including extremely high heat and low tree canopy. She shared that the money needs to stop going to just the economic center in wealthy neighborhoods. People in Hunting Park pay taxes just like everybody else in the city, yet the park in Hunting Park does not look cared for and isn't maintained like the parks we see in Germantown or South Philly or Center City or the Northeast, these wealthier neighborhoods. The city needs to give that money to Hunting Park neighborhood to make sure that the area looks as good as those other neighborhoods. What is happening now is not justice, and people of the community should not have to be wealthy in order to have their parks cared for. So this is a really impactful quote of what the experience is like and how people see the ways that we care for our parks play out. And of course, there's a lot of nuance and a lot of complexity that we went into earlier about why those disparities exist. But for the average residents, this is how it feels. And finally, just one last quote. The plan needs to work, and we need to be accountable to people. This one man in West Philly shared and it was echoed in other community meetings, this being tired of people coming in, asking questions, people consistently having to prove that they're in need of resources. And then a plan is made and nothing feels like it changes materially in their lives. He shared, we feel like we've been through this before. The city has made plans involving trees. They're big and exciting and make promises. But after a few years, nothing happens. We don't hear about the plan anymore. Then they come back saying that they're making a new plan, but we never got any of the promises of the old plan. We need you to listen to us and make your plan, but you have to stick to it and show us how you're going to make a change. So as we think about what we're doing, you know, as we're designing our plan, making those big ambitious recommendations, but also making sure that we are being accountable to the community, and that this isn't the last time that people have a voice in this work, and that we can show how we're materially making a change in people's lives, is going to be really important as we move forward. So there's so much more that we could share, but I'd love to open it up to some questions and comments.
I am bowled over, as I'm sure everyone else is here. Let's leave the screen on for a minute with your contact information, and then if we could stop screen sharing, just so we have the intimacy of our faces again. We have a lot of comments in the chat as you were speaking just now, Erica and Marissa. And Erica, actually, before we continue, it was brought to my attention you used to be co-chair here of UEC, which you failed to mention. So
yeah, 2013.
You created something really, really great, and it's good to have you back. So I don't know if there's anything in the chat window that caught your attention, or Kinsey, if you had something there that caught your attention. I know, Erica, you were responding in real time.
I'll read out some of the answers. So someone had asked, what's the budget for planning? And Erica answered the total budget was $242,750, with community outreach being around 90,000 of that, and 15,000 in direct expenses, which included stipends for the ambassadors and others of like the paid outreach people.
I can also just really quickly say that that was paid through foundation support, 2 different foundations, part of a corporate sponsorship, and some generous funds from the state. So we cobbled it together.
Karen Cox asks, any thoughts on how to share the burden of cost, as it's an issue that everyone is facing in the industry? So I think that was the burden of cost of caring for young and mature trees.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to answer that question right now because we're still developing recommendations and we haven't really gone over it with our project team. So I don't really have anything to share on like our solutions to these problems yet. It's more trying to focus on kind of how we heard people. But I'm absolutely happy to come back, Marissa and I and others, to talk about what our final recommendations are based on what we heard.
Clara from Tree Pittsburgh asks, how do you handle the point of accountability and follow through with administration changes and other things in the city?
It's a really good question. I mean, in part, some of our staff are funded through some of those other non-city methods, which in some ways protects us from changeover of the city, but in other ways it makes them vulnerable to losing that funding because they're not like part of the city budget. So we kind of are trying to focus on what we're doing in our own team, and then teaching those above us the importance of all of these things, or kind of drawing out what they are already interested in supporting and how they're interested in supporting it, and holding them accountable. But it's really tricky. I don't have a great answer to that one. Marissa, do you have any thoughts?
One thing that we discuss a lot is just increasing transparency. So no matter who's in charge, the people of Philadelphia have the knowledge and information they need to advocate for themselves, and also just committing to, like, to the extent that we can within our own team, the accountability of coming back and giving people updates, and continuing that engagement. But it's definitely, a lot of our work is going to be building capitalizing on all of these people who did who engaged and gave their time to this process, and making sure that they remain advocates in this cause, and continually fight for consistent funding for this work into the future, so that we can actually follow through on all of the recommendations.
What is the % of the overall city budget that's allocated to public tree management?
That's a really hard question to answer, because I see Ben smiling, who's in our street tree office here in the city. The amount of money that we have at Parks and Rec to care for trees, which is street trees specifically, is really abysmally low. The Parks and Rec department cares for street trees and park trees in the city, and the Parks and Rec budget itself is kind of absurd compared to the amount of land that we care for. And then other departments do tree work, like the water department, the streets department to some extent, and then other nonprofits, but it can be very difficult to figure out what the actual amount of money spent on trees is, because it's not always allocated as tree money. It's like wrapped up in other project management costs and capital project costs. And we haven't really done a full analysis to answer that question of like what we spend on trees specifically.
Julie asked again about the does anyone have experience addressing the cost sharing burden of property owners or other cities? I do know that Tree Folks in Austin, Texas has a remove and replace program that they've been running for, I think, the last 2 or 3 years, where they have funding to compensate arborists to come and remove hazardous trees at no cost to the property owner, and then they replant. Tree Folks is the tree planting nonprofit of that area, and I think that I've heard a lot of people talk about that program, especially considering this idea of sharing the burden. So maybe at another time we could bring them in to talk about that program, but that's the only one that
we have something in Massachusetts that's different. It's not about tree care, it's about tree planting through the Greening the Gateway Cities program, that brings along state resources to gateway cities, which are sort of economically depressed cities across the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. I don't know what they've only been around for, I know Elizabeth might be able to answer the question here, but maybe 10 years, 15 years or so. I don't know what their long-term tree management plan is actually for private owners. I don't know, Elizabeth, if you know from your work. No, okay.
I guess I'll just note that, David, in Massachusetts, that seems like a really rare configuration where like the state is so prominent, because
Right.
in a lot of the cities that are part of our network, it's the municipal government that's championing these causes and or with federal support, but that the state level is so involved seems unique to Massachusetts in my
It really is a unique program, and actually I'm thinking maybe it'd be an opportunity for a future UEC talk, because it involves not only the DCR but also the cabinet level of the Energy and Environment Office work together on this, and they use, I believe the funding stream comes from energy efficient, like what you pay on your heating bill for energy efficiency costs. So in Massachusetts we have a program called Mass Saves, where if you want to like update your windows, you can get sort of a reduction on cost, or you get money back. So there's such a big pile of money, but it's only for certain municipalities, and it's always done in partnership with a local nonprofit. So there's sort of like 3 or 4 levels, but it is very unique. And California, I think, has something sort of similar on the state level through their California Relief Program. That's statewide, but it's funded differently. I'm going back here to the questions, and they're coming in fast and furious, and we only have 4 minutes left. Cassie here had a question. Let's see, what are you thinking about strategies for creating awareness and buy-in for need to address tree inequities, so to bring along those who have access to power and resources, not just those who, I think, Cassie, your question is not just centering local voices, but how do you bring in long-term sustainability and people who might be able to support this work in the future?
I answered in brief underneath, but
Oh, sorry.
yeah, we've been trying to do outreach to city and state legislators to get them to kind of take ownership over the plan and talk about it with their constituents. And now that our outreach period is over, we're following up with them and trying to kind of feel out who has the appetite to sponsor various legislation change and funding and stuff like that. So it's like a complicated, but we're focusing on it and trying to strategize internally how to do that. And it also involves like creating a community of advocacy who can put pressure on them from outside of this process. And that's also kind of a separate thing that we need to be working on.
So I see a question here from Stephanie, and before I turn to it, I just wanted to open up the floor. My teacher voice in me is saying moments of silence are good. So awkward silences. So if anyone wants to jump in and ask a question.
I actually have a question about the different languages that you guys received from your survey responses, because I work in New York City and we have so many different people speaking so many different languages, but I think a lot of our, I don't know, public facing documents, all of that stuff about trees and things anyway, is mostly in English. So I was wondering, how did you, how much, I guess, funding do you really need to translate all these materials to different languages and then process all of the responses as well? Just, yeah, I'm curious.
Erica and I are smiling because we got in trouble for how much money we spent. We spent our department's entire budget for translation on translating this,
Totally
which speaks more to how little money is in the budget than how big the need is. But we selected the languages based on the percentage of people who we looked at, like, who the biggest speakers were, who did not have high levels of English proficiency, and then looked at like what percentage of those folks sorry, I'm saying this poorly. We like went through and looked at everybody who spoke multiple languages in the city, or mostly spoke a different language at home, and then evaluated based on kind of where we knew that we had partners and where we were trying to target outreach. So also looking at knowing that we are going to try to be working in an area of South Philadelphia that has where we work with a partner that has 18 languages represented on staff and still isn't able to speak every language that's in that community. But knowing that we had done work with them and that they had in the past prioritized specific languages for translation and getting it translated into like Spanish and Chinese, of course, but then also Khmer and Vietnamese, which and I can't remember if we did Burmese as well. I think we did. And then also looking at some of the other areas, knowing that there are areas in the northeast of Philadelphia where there's a large Russian population. There's a lot of people who don't speak English well, but speak Russian or read Russian at home, and then translating it there. But I think it came out to something like $4,000 in the end. And because most of our questions were not open-ended, it didn't actually take that much to translate it back, because we knew that people were just clicking certain things. And we have mostly relied on Google Translate to comprehend those responses, because you can get a pretty good gist of what people are telling you back. But we wanted to make sure that when we were asking those questions, we were asking them in a like culturally competent way, and in a way that how people would actually be reading well, better than anything Google Translate can do.
Yeah, that's great
Oh,
to hear. Yeah.
So I
And
just wanted to, sorry, I just want to say it is 11 o'clock now, and I wanted to give Erica and Marissa a chance to, if you have meetings or anything, to leave. But if we want to leave this room open for a couple more minutes, I'm happy to do that. But I know we all have busy days. So I wanted to give first a chance to thank you for an amazing presentation. The comments here are flowing in fast and furious. We have recorded this session. We will post it. Kinsey, who do we have next month? Do you remember?
That's a great question. Give me 1 second to pull
We
it up.
do have someone posted for next month. And then I believe we have someone for September, maybe even October. If you or someone you know of is interested in presenting, please reach out to either me or Kinsey. We are looking for the fall for some presenters. And, as Kinsey finds the next speaker, I was just thinking, Marissa and Erica, your framing here, and I've been thinking about this in our own organization, our work in Boston, and some of the national conversations of trees as infrastructure. It's such a moment right now for us to talk about this as necessary infrastructure. It's not a nice to have, but an essential part of our urban infrastructure. With the infrastructure bill coming up, of course, but I think that framing is going to get us places where hopefully, as we invest in infrastructure, trees are recognized as an important part of it. So I think that came through in your presentation.
I also want to say that, through the work that we have been doing and all the ways that we've been talking to people, we are also trying to emphasize the importance to cultural and spiritual and mental health of trees, and the equity issue as a huge part of it too. I think that this field, we have been trying to talk about trees as infrastructure for a long time. And I think now with the infrastructure bill, everyone is trying to frame everything as infrastructure. And so we're trying to do that, but we're also trying to make sure that we are talking about the squishier side that is so important to people's actual real lives. I don't know if Marissa, if you had anything else to say about that, but it's been a really big part of our messaging.
yeah, I think that the trees as infrastructure is a really important piece when we're talking to legislature and practitioners and trying to get laws in place, but also knowing that kind of framing doesn't square with how communities feel trees impact them as well. That they recognize that trees clean our air and that's essential, and that they soak up water and that's essential, and they cool our blocks and that's essential. But it's also that really important place where stories are passed along under the shade of a tree from grandparents to kids, that it's the connection to a homeland, it's the connection to something bigger than yourself in a way that infrastructure doesn't really sum up. So making sure that you're also acknowledging and speaking in those terms, especially when you're engaging with communities.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. So Kinsey, who's speaking next month? You have it there?
Yes, next month we have Katie Lauder, the Executive Director of Baltimore Green Space.
Amazing. So I'll leave the room open. Marissa and Erica, if you have to leave, don't be shy, and we'll see you all next month.
Thank you. We do have a meeting, and John's in
Okay.
that meeting too, so we're all gonna maybe say goodbye.
All right. Well, thank you for your time. Be well, everyone. Stay cool out
Thank
there.
you.
Everyone.
Thank you.
Really great.